Hi everyone, I'm James and I'm back. Really sorry for the late video as I was extremely busy after the chemistry paper 2. So here are my comments about the O-level chemistry paper 2 2025. In general, I found that the paper was comparable to previous years, but Reddit said that it was very easy and several tuition centers online also said that it was very easy and one should be prepared for a very steep bell curve. For me personally, I took about 1 hour 25 minutes to finish the paper and I had 20 minutes left to check. While I felt that there were many giveaway questions, there were certain explanation questions that needed higher order thinking skills and were not so direct and required some close look about the data that they presented in a question. Personally, most of the marks that I think that I lost were on memorization questions because I didn't bother to study the details about the reaction conditions as well as the definition in certain questions. I made several mistakes in the paper. The first would be that I stated polyamide instead of nylon. Although, as everybody knows, polyamide is nylon, but the question asks about which fabric. So if I stated polyamide, I'm actually not being as exact as I wanted to be. And secondly would be the hydrogen addition conditions. I totally didn't study that. The definition of atomic mass. In fact, in the paper, I stated that it is relative to a hydrogen atom, which was completely wrong, and it is supposed to be 1/12 of a carbon-12 atom. Last but not least, another silly mistake that I made was that I stated antimony trioxide, as I was pretty confused about it being metallic. Antimony is a metalloid, so that led to the confusion. Despite me answering the question right behind correctly, because I stated that antimony is similar to nitrogen, and therefore it can form three covalent bonds with hydrogen. Here are my thoughts on individual questions. For question 1, the last part asks about why graphite can conduct electricity, and the answer should be pretty obvious because it had delocalized electrons. The trick to this question was that they asked about using a diagram to explain why graphite could conduct electricity. So for this, upon closer observation, you can see that for each carbon atom, it is only bonded to three other carbon atoms, and therefore the remaining electron is actually delocalized. So that is the answer that I think that they're looking for. For question 2, I almost drew NO with a dative font, but that is actually not in the O-level syllabus. I was pretty confused at the start, and then after finishing the whole paper, I revisited the question and I realized that I didn't have to think so much, and I just followed what the question said, and then I drew a double bond, therefore leaving the nitrogen with only 7 valence electrons. I think I almost complicated the question unnecessarily because I had more knowledge about chemical bonding. Next will be question 5. I found that there's a lot of information in a question because it is a series of experiments regarding reacting different metals with each other and then recording the rise in temperature if there's a certain reaction. I found this question the most confusing because there were many experiments, but what paid off for me was that before the test, I memorized the reactivity series, so it was pretty easy for me to cross-check if my answer made sense or not. Generally, I struggled through this question the most because of the amount of information given in all the experiments, but knowing the reactivity series helped me to get the correct answer eventually. Next would be question 6. I totally forgotten the definition of atomic mass, so I tried to smoke my way through by saying that relative atomic mass is relative to the mass of a hydrogen 1 atom. However, that is actually not correct. It is actually relative to 1/12 of a carbon 12 atom. Therefore, I am very sure that I lost that mark. For question 7, this is the question whereby they gave a lot of information in one whole page and then they want us to answer the questions based on all the information. I found this question pretty manageable, but some parts required more thinking, such as why the SMR reaction is needed is because carbon monoxide is produced as an intermediate, and therefore the SMR reaction is needed to remove the carbon monoxide intermediate so that it wouldn't pollute the environment. Another part question which I felt that required more thinking was that how to separate water vapor from a gas mixture. In fact, the answer to this is pretty simple. The air just has to be cooled down to room temperature in order to make the water vapor condense, and therefore letting all the remaining components remain as gas. Last but not least, the question 9 and question 10, which is basically the end all. I chose question 10 because when I checked the paper, it was pretty obvious that the front part was a giveaway because 6 out of the 10 marks are stoichiometry questions. The remaining 2 parts are a bit trickier, but the calcium sulfate forming insoluble coating is actually a very familiar question because when I practiced the past papers, I also saw that a similar trick in a question whereby when an insoluble coating is formed, it stops the reaction from happening. Therefore, I didn't think that this question was too difficult, especially as I practiced similar questions before. Last but not least, they asked how to prepare calcium sulfate, and to suggest precipitation needs some thinking because the most important thing is that calcium sulfate is insoluble, so the reactants must all be aqueous. In conclusion, for this chemistry paper 2, I was able to answer the questions, but it took me some time to think and phrase explanation questions because I felt that they were more indirect and they were looking for certain keywords, and therefore I had to try to think what was Cambridge expecting me to put in the answer. Thirdly, it paid off to study the reactivity series because I find that generally the weakest topics that I have are all about inorganic chemistry. And when I studied the reactivity series, it allowed me to cross-check my answers against the series that I recalled, so that my answers at least made some sense. Next was that I dropped some marks on the memorization questions, but I was already prepared to. I was okay with dropping the memorization question marks because I felt that there weren't that many marks on those memorization questions, and I do not think that it will really affect the grade. So in conclusion, I found that while some memorization is needed for chemistry because of the different compounds, increasingly SEAB is setting more indirect questions that require thinking, and it requires on-the-spot thinking from all the data that they presented. Therefore, what is the most important thing that I took out from this is that memorizing is important, but more important is the conceptual understanding behind the question, because SAB can phrase the same question but in many different forms. Thanks for watching.